This lecture is part 2 of hormones and the endocrine system. In the last lecture, we began talking about the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Recall that the hypothalamus is part of the brain. It lies below the thalamus. And the hypothalamus is very important for coordinating a lot of responses of the body. Now, the hypothalamus has neurons that have cell bodies within the hypothalamus that send axons into the posterior pituitary, which is a continuation of the nervous system. And there, those cells will release certain hormones, such as oxytocin and ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, directly into the blood stream. So those are neurohormones. And in contrast, the anterior pituitary is a true endocrine organ or gland in the sense that it's derived from epithelial tissue. The anterior pituitary is under the control of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has neurons that will secrete hormones that influence the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. As a quick reminder, the posterior pituitary stores and secretes hormones that are made in the hypothalamus, and these two hormones are antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. And the anterior pituitary makes and releases hormones under the control of the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary gland controls many diverse processes, such as metabolism and reproduction. The secretion of all anterior pituitary hormones is under the control of the hypothalamus. For example, thyrotropin hormone releasing hormone, or TRH, is released from the hypothalamus, and it stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. TSH then travels throughout the circulatory system, and there are receptors in the thyroid gland, and this TSH will stimulate the thyroid gland to then release thyroid hormones. The hypothalamic hormones can be classified as either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. A releasing hormone stimulates the anterior pituitary to release a hormone. An inhibiting hormone inhibits the anterior pituitary to release a hormone. In this case, TRH stimulates the anterior pituitary to release TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. Therefore, TRH is a releasing hormone rather than an inhibiting hormone. Let's look at hypothalamic hormones in a little more detail. These hormones are created in the cell bodies of neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus. These cells are neurons. The hormones are moved down the axons, and then they're released at the axon terminals, and they enter into capillaries. So there's a capillary here. The direction of blood flow is in this direction. They're then carried, these neurohormones are carried by portal vessels, then to the anterior pituitary. Within the anterior pituitary, there are endocrine cells that will have specific receptors for some of these hormones. And therefore, these hormones will either stimulate these anterior pituitary cells to release a hormone. Those would be considered releasing hormones, and other ones that inhibit the anterior pituitary neurons from releasing hormones would be considered inhibitory neurohormones. Let's look at the anterior pituitary hormones in a little more detail. Many anterior pituitary hormones are tropic hormones. A tropic hormone stimulates an endocrine gland to release a hormone. Don't confuse tropic with trophic. A trophic hormone is a hormone that has a growth effect. So these are two different terms that are very similar sounding. And so tropic comes from the Greek tropos, which means to bend or to turn, whereas trophic comes from the Greek word that means to pertaining to food and nourishment, which is often used to mean to stimulate growth. So if we look at TSH, TSH is released by the anterior pituitary, thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. It stimulates the thyroid gland to then release thyroid hormones. Therefore, TSH is a tropic hormone. Let's next look at 3 examples. We have, for example, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which acts on the thyroid to stimulate the release of thyroid hormones. It has only tropic effects. It only stimulates the thyroid gland to release other hormones. In contrast, you have prolactin, which is also released by the anterior pituitary gland. It acts on the mammary glands, and it has only non-tropic effects, meaning it directly has an effect on the mammary glands. It stimulates the production of milk. Growth hormone, or GH, is released also by the anterior pituitary. It acts on the liver, bones, and other tissues. It has both tropic effects and non-tropic effects. So, for example, it stimulates the liver to release hormones, but it also has direct effects on some tissues of the body. Let's next look at the regulation of these anterior pituitary hormones, and we'll use thyroid gland regulation as our example. And what we'll see is that there's an important negative feedback loop that controls the levels of thyroid hormones in our blood. So if we look at this, this is the whole circuit that we've looked at so far. We have neurosecretory cells, which are neurons, in the hypothalamus. They release the thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH. These travel to the anterior pituitary. So from one capillary bed via the portal vessels to another capillary bed. There they have an effect on anterior pituitary endocrine cells that release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. This goes to the circulation. There are receptors in the thyroid gland that are stimulated, and these cells are stimulated then to release thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones then travel throughout the circulation, and they have various diverse effects on the body. So now these circulating thyroid hormones, and there's 2 of them, which we'll talk about in a second, these have negative feedback effects at the level of both the anterior pituitary as well as the hypothalamus. In other words, if there's an increase in the level of thyroid hormones, then there'll be a decrease in the level of TSH. This will have an inhibitory effect on these anterior pituitary neurons, and they'll release less thyroid stimulating hormone. This makes sense because if you have a lot of thyroid hormone, then you wouldn't want to have too much, because having too much can be problematic. Additionally, the thyroid hormones act on these neurosecretory cells, these neurons within the hypothalamus. Recall that these are the cells that release TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone. So if there's a lot of thyroid hormone, these neurons are inhibited and they release less thyrotropin releasing hormone. And remember, it's thyrotropin releasing hormone that stimulates these other cells in the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. So both of these effects would negative feedback loops would have essentially the same effect. They both decrease the amount of TSH that's released, and therefore they decrease the amount of stimulation of the thyroid gland, and that would lead to a decrease in the amount of thyroid hormone that's secreted. And this would help to keep the level of thyroid hormone in the blood close to its set point. In other words, there's a narrow range of blood values for these concentration of these 2 hormones. They shouldn't be too high or too low. A patient is diagnosed as having hypothyroidism. It's been determined that the low secretion level of thyroid hormones is due to a problem with the level of the thyroid gland itself, not the anterior pituitary gland or the hypothalamus. She begins taking levothyroxine, a synthetic form of thyroxine, or T4, similar to the endogenous hormone produced by the thyroid gland. Relative to her blood concentration of TSH before beginning the treatment, what will happen to her blood concentration of TSH after 2 weeks of treatment? The correct answer is that her TSH levels will decrease. When she had hypothyroidism, that meant that she wasn't producing enough thyroid hormones. Therefore, there was a lack of negative feedback onto the anterior pituitary as well as the hypothalamus. This means that if there's less inhibition, then there would have been more TRH, a thyrotropin releasing hormone produced by the hypothalamus, and that would have stimulated the anterior pituitary to secrete additional thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. And also, if there's less inhibition by thyroid hormones at the level of the anterior pituitary, then that would also lead to the cells in the anterior pituitary secreting more thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. Now, once she actually begins treatment, she'll be taking this synthetic form of thyroid hormone called levothyroxine, or T4, and it will have the same inhibitory effect as the natural or endogenous thyroid hormone, or T4, would have. And therefore, it will start to inhibit the hypothalamus, which will release less TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone, which will lead to less stimulation of the anterior pituitary cells that release TSH. So therefore, there'd be a decrease in thyroid stimulating hormone secretion. And also, this new synthetic thyroxine would also have an effect at the level of the anterior pituitary. It would directly inhibit those cells from releasing as much TSH. So there'd be two reasons, essentially, for these cells to now release less thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. Thyroid hormone is very important for metabolism, and disruption of thyroid hormone production and regulation can result in serious disorders. Interestingly, in the past, it was actually quite commonplace for people to have disorders related to thyroid hormone production. These people typically lived away from the ocean. So in seafood, such as fish, and also in plants from the ocean, like algae and so forth, there's plenty of iodine. If people that live far away from the ocean, it was actually quite difficult for them to produce enough thyroid hormone. And the reason for this, you can see here in this diagram, which shows that here's thyroxine, which is T4, one of the two thyroid hormones. You can see that it has iodine atoms, and the other one has three iodine atoms. So triiodothyronine is T3, it has three, and tetraiodothyronine, where T4 has four, and T4 is also referred to as thyroxine. So if you lived far away from the ocean, then it was difficult to produce this hormone. And so you would have low levels of circulating thyroid hormone, and this was, again, due to the insufficient iodine. Now, the pituitary, in response to this low level of thyroid hormone, we recall that there's a negative feedback loop. Well, that loop wouldn't work very well. And so the anterior pituitary would continue to secrete a tremendous amount of TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. So much so that, in fact, the thyroid gland would get larger and larger and larger. And this results in a goiter. And so here, and we've had this problem, for many years. Here's a 2,000-year-old tobacco pipe from a Native American burial ground in southern Ohio. And you can see the neck is very enlarged, and this is almost certainly a goiter. The reason we know this is because these people lived very far from the ocean. They didn't have access to food with a lot of iodine. And other similar statues have been found in South America, also showing goiters. So it could be that this is a person that just has a very thick neck, but it's actually much more likely that this is showing a goiter. Now, in modern times, we have access to seafood, but we also can simply buy iodized salt. And this would supply us with the iodine we need to make the two thyroid hormones, the triiodothyronine, T3, and the tetraiodothyronine, T4, which is also called thyroxine. In addition to regulating metabolism, some hormones regulate growth. Growth hormone is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland and has both tropic and non-tropic effects, as we discussed earlier. The liver is a major target that responds to growth hormone by releasing insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs. IGFs stimulate bone and cartilage growth. Excess growth hormone during childhood can cause gigantism. So you can see, for example, here, Andre the Giant. He was a French professional wrestler and actor, and he certainly had gigantism. So he was very large in stature, very strong, as you can see in the picture. Now, if you have the excess growth hormone secretion in adulthood, this causes a slightly different condition. You can have a condition called acromegaly, which leads to growth of body parts that are responsive to the hormone. So the face, hands, and feet continue to be responsive. And so if we look at the face, people with acromegaly will have a prominent brow. Some of the soft tissues, such as the nose, ears, and lips, will be enlarged, and they'll have a prominent jaw. And actually, you can see by looking at Andre that he had both excess growth hormone during childhood, leading to his incredibly large stature, but he did have all the hallmarks of acromegaly during adulthood too. He had a prominent brow ridge, large lips, and so forth. And so he basically suffered from both conditions, childhood as well as adult excess growth hormone secretion. Lack of growth hormone during childhood can lead to dwarfism. Nowadays, this can easily treated. We can make synthetic human growth hormone, and so a person that was lacking the ability to secrete their own growth hormone would get injections of this synthetic growth hormone, and their growth would be perfectly normal. So far, we've looked at how hormones affect metabolism with thyroid hormone. We looked at how hormones affect growth with growth hormone. Now we're going to look at how endocrine signaling regulates homeostasis. And we're going to look at a very important type of homeostasis, which is the homeostatic regulation of calcium in the blood. So it turns out that calcium is extremely important. If you have low calcium levels, this can lead to convulsive skeletal muscle contractions. It can lead to poor functioning of the brain. In contrast, if you have high calcium levels, this can actually lead to precipitation of calcium phosphate in body tissue, which can cause organ damage. So both extremes are bad. We need to keep calcium levels essentially just right for a person to be happy and healthy. So in mammals, the main hormone that controls the calcium level in blood is called parathyroid hormone, or PTH. It's released by parathyroid glands, and we can take a look at this picture to see where the parathyroid glands are. So we have the thyroid gland, which is in the neck. If we look behind the thyroid gland, so here's a back view of it, we see four glands about the size, maybe a little bit bigger, but sort of shaped like grains of rice. These are the parathyroid glands. And they're very responsive they sense and are responsive to the calcium level of calcium in the blood. So calcium is a regulated variable. It's sensed by the parathyroid glands, and the calcium has a certain set point, which is a narrow range of values that it generally your body will try and keep it within this range. So when the calcium levels fall below a certain point, then the parathyroid the parathyroid glands will increase their release, the amount of secretion of parathyroid hormone. The first thing I want to say about parathyroid secretion is that it's constitutively secreted. This means that it's secreted in an ongoing manner. So it may sound as if I'm talking about these parathyroid glands being stimulated and suddenly releasing it in a burst. That's not really the way it works. It's always releasing some parathyroid hormone, and the level of parathyroid hormone secretion, though, changes as the blood calcium level changes. So, for example, if the blood calcium levels were to drop, then that would stimulate the parathyroid glands to release even more parathyroid hormone than they normally would. So there'd be an increase in the ongoing level of secretion, and therefore an increase in the plasma concentration of parathyroid hormone. So what does parathyroid hormone do? Well, it's going to increase the level of blood calcium, and it does this through a number of mechanisms. First, you have a large reservoir of calcium in your bones, so it will release calcium from bone. Uh, at the same time, it'll also stimulate the reabsorption of calcium in the kidneys. So recall how the kidneys work. There's a filtrate that's formed, and then that filtrate is refined, and finally it leaves the collecting tubules in the kidney as urine. Now, in the process of refining the filtrate, um, if there is calcium in that filtrate, and so if there's a need for calcium, calcium can be actively reabsorbed. And so parathyroid hormone would be integral to stimulating the kidney to do that reabsorption. Parathyroid hormone indirectly affects calcium by promoting the production of vitamin D from a precursor molecule that's obtained either from food or it can be synthesized in the skin by exposure to sunlight. So then vitamin D stimulates the uptake of calcium from food by acting on the small intestine. In this picture, you can see that the control of blood calcium level is in fact a negative feedback loop. Let's imagine that we start at a normal blood calcium level of about 10 milligrams per 100 milliliters. Now imagine that for some reason the blood calcium level drops. Well, this will stimulate the parathyroid glands to release more parathyroid hormone than they normally would. Parathyroid hormone, or PTH, would then stimulate calcium uptake through reabsorption at the level of the kidney, and it will promote the activation of vitamin D. Vitamin D will act at the level of the small intestine to increase calcium absorption. At the same time, parathyroid hormone will stimulate the release of calcium from bone. So this obviously is a good source of calcium. And then all of these effects combined will lead to an increase in calcium blood levels. So this will then bring the calcium level back to its normal set point of about 10 milligrams per 100 milliliters. So far, we've discussed what would happen if the blood calcium level decreases. Then you would have an increase in the secretion of parathyroid hormone. Now, what if the opposite happened? What if a person starts taking lots and lots of calcium supplements, too much, in fact, and there's suddenly an increase in calcium concentration within the blood? Well, this will actually act on the parathyroid glands. They will start to secrete less parathyroid hormone, and so that would essentially have the opposite effect that we just talked about. And so that would be a major change that would help to control the blood calcium levels just by simply reversing some of the things we would talk about. So, for example, there'd be less reabsorption of calcium in the kidney. There'd be less production of vitamin D, and therefore less absorption of calcium in the small intestine, and there would be less release of calcium from bone. Now, there is, in fact, another hormone that's also important, and it's calcitonin. Now, this one also responds, the secretion of calcitonin is also responsive to blood level of calcium, but it's in the opposite direction. If the blood calcium level increases, then there'll be an increase in the secretion of calcitonin. It's secreted by the thyroid gland. So it's the third hormone that's released by the thyroid gland. There was T3, T4, and now calcitonin. Calcitonin's effect is to decrease the level of blood calcium. And the way it does this is it stimulates calcium deposition in bones. So instead of releasing calcium from bones, we're now putting it onto bones. It also increases secretion of calcium by the kidneys. So again, if you were taking an excess amount of calcium supplements, that could be very damaging to your body. So your kidney would attempt to get rid of it by actively secreting calcium. Now, it turns out that of the two hormones, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, in humans, in adults, calcitonin is not that important. You can basically control your calcium levels perfectly well with just parathyroid hormones. Calcitonin is important, however, during childhood. This is a period of extensive bone growth. And so this ability of calcitonin to stimulate calcium deposition in bones is extremely important. The secretion of PTH is regulated by the level of calcium in the blood. Low blood calcium concentration, blank PTH to be secreted, whereas increased calcium concentration, blank PTH secretion. The correct answer is that low blood calcium concentration stimulates PTH to be secreted, whereas increased calcium concentration inhibits PTH secretion. Hormones are very important for the stress response of the human body. And there's actually too many different hormones that work on stress to really go through in this lecture. So we're going to focus on just the adrenal hormones, and we're going to specifically look at the ones that are secreted by the medulla. The adrenal glands are located atop the kidneys, hence the name adrenal. Ad meaning on top, and then renal referring to the kidneys. So here they are above the kidneys. Each adrenal gland consists of two glands, actually. There's the adrenal medulla, which is the inner portion shown here, and there's the adrenal cortex, which is the outer portion. Now, these two parts of the adrenal glands are actually developmentally distinct. The adrenal cortex consists of true endocrine glands, which are of epithelial origin, whereas the secretory cells in the adrenal medulla actually develop from neural tissue. The adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline. The terms epinephrine and norepinephrine are the preferred terms in the United States, whereas adrenaline and noradrenaline are the British terms. These hormones are both members of a class of compounds called catecholamines. These are amine-derived hormones that are derived from the amino acid tyrosine. Both of these hormones coordinate a set of physiological responses that comprise the fight or flight response. So this is classically described as if you see something very scary, like a mountain lion coming towards you, your heart would beat faster and you'd start to get ready essentially for either fight or flight. Together, epinephrine and norepinephrine have many different effects on the body that prepare you for an emergency situation. They trigger the release of glucose and fatty acids into the blood. The glucose is stored in the liver in a polymer that's highly branched called glycogen. And so epinephrine will stimulate the liver to break down the glycogen and into glucose, and the glucose is then transported out of the liver and into the blood. And epinephrine also acts on adipose tissue, in other words, fat cells. And these cells contain a tremendous number of triglycerides, and epinephrine will stimulate these cells to undergo to break down the triglycerides in a process called lipolysis. And then the individual fatty acids are then released into the blood, and they can be used as fuel by skeletal muscle as well as the heart. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, there's an increase in heart rate, and that's both epinephrine and norepinephrine are involved in that. There's also an increase in the strength with which the heart beats. And again, both hormones help out in increasing the strength of the contraction of the heart. Epinephrine is also known to do bronchodilation. So in other words, for someone who has asthma or trouble breathing, due to constriction of the bronchioles, which are the tubes inside the lungs, this would help to dilate these tubes, which have smooth muscle associated with them, which would help them breathe, and it would help with an asthma attack. These also, so that would of course help with getting oxygen into the blood in an emergency situation. Also, epinephrine and norepinephrine will help to direct blood towards the organs that need it in an emergency situation. So these organs would be the heart, the brain, skeletal muscle. And blood flow will be directed away from the skin, the digestive system, and the kidneys. And you can see in this picture, here's an idea. So you'd have stress, maybe that's the mountain lion coming towards you. So you'll have neurons in the brain that will generate action potentials or nerve impulses. These go then to the level of the spinal cord. There are neurons that exit from the what's called the ventral horn of the spinal cord through spinal nerves. And then these neurons will innervate, meaning to make synapses within the adrenal medulla. And there will be a release of epinephrine and norepinephrine as hormones into the blood. So you can see these are entering into capillaries and then going into general circulation. We actually talked about epinephrine's effect on liver cells previously. Epinephrine coordinates the response in liver cells by binding to the G protein coupled receptor. This activates a G protein, which translocates in the membrane. It then will bind to adenyl cyclase, which is an enzyme which will convert ATP, adenosine triphosphate, into cyclic AMP, which is a second messenger. Cyclic AMP then activates protein kinase A, which can add a phosphate group to other proteins. And in some cases, it will inhibit the protein, so it will inhibit glycogen synthesis by inhibiting certain enzymes, but it'll promote glycogen breakdown by activating other enzymes. And once the glycogen is broken down into glucose, there are transport proteins that allow for glucose to move out into the extracellular fluid, and from there through the capillary walls and into general circulation. As I mentioned, epinephrine has an interesting effect. It will increase the blood flow to certain organs, such as skeletal muscle, and the brain, and the heart, but it will decrease blood flow to the skin, the kidneys, and the intestine, the digestive tract. So how does it do this? How does it have these different effects? So let's look at that in a little more detail. So in smooth muscle, in the wall of a blood vessel that supplies skeletal muscle, epinephrine will bind to beta adrenergic receptors. Once it binds, the cell then relaxes. And so then this means that the blood vessel will dilate. This is then going to increase blood flow to the skeletal muscle. Now, in smooth muscle cells in the wall of a blood vessel that supplies blood to the intestines, epinephrine will bind to a different receptor called an alpha adrenergic receptor. Once it binds to this receptor, you have the opposite cellular response. Instead of relaxing, the muscle contracts. And so these smooth muscles encircle these small blood vessels that supply blood to the intestine. And when these cells contract, well, that will decrease the diameter of these blood vessels, and this will then decrease the blood flow into the intestines. So it's very interesting. We have the same molecule, epinephrine, having very different effects depending on the type of receptor on the target cell. I mentioned earlier, and we talked about the mechanism through which epinephrine binding to receptors on liver cells will lead to the breakdown of glycogen and then the release of glucose into the interstitial space. And then from there, the glucose enters into the bloodstream and helps to supply the brain, skeletal muscle, and the heart with energy in a time of emergency. But it was the interesting point of this slide is that we have the same receptor. So It turns out, and I didn't mention the type of receptor before, but the receptors on the liver cells are in fact adrenergic receptors, just as when you look at the smooth muscle cells in the wall of blood vessel that supplies skeletal muscle, those are also beta adrenergic receptors. So recall that when epinephrine binds to beta adrenergic receptors in these smooth muscle cells in the wall of the blood vessels that supply skeletal muscle, these cells relax, they encircle the blood vessel, and therefore the blood vessel dilates, and there's increased blood flow to the skeletal muscle. We have quite a different cellular response in liver cells. Epinephrine binds to the beta receptor, and then there's breakdown of the glycogen, leading to glucose released from the cell. And this then leads to an increased blood glucose level, which of course is very important in a time of emergency. So the point here is that we have the same receptor, the beta adrenergic receptor, but very different responses at the cellular level. And the reason for this is that the intracellular signaling cascades are very different in these two cells. And I'm not going to go into all the details. We did talk a bit about the details here about adenylyl cyclase and protein kinase A and so forth. But the point is, in these cells that also have the beta adrenergic receptor, you'd have a different intracellular signaling cascade that then leads to the relaxation of the muscle cell. So in this case, we have one molecule binding to the same receptor, and yet because within the cells, the response is a little bit different. You have completely different final cellular responses. So we're going to end there for this chapter. We've definitely covered a lot of things, and so that's a good ending point.